At exactly 5:15 every morning, before the first executive stepped into the glass tower of Crestview Technologies in downtown Chicago, one man quietly unlocked the front doors. He wore faded blue coveralls, a gray baseball cap, old work boots with worn-out soles. To everyone who saw him, he was just another janitor. Invisible. Forgettable. His name was Samuel Brooks. He was 64 years old. Soft-spoken. Polite. The kind of man who smiled even when no one smiled back. Every morning, he swept the marble lobby, emptied overflowing trash bins, polished the elevators, and made sure every conference room looked perfect before the executives arrived. By 8 a.m., the building sparkled. Most employees never even thought about who made it happen. "Morning, Sam," said the security guard, Marcus. "Morning," Samuel replied with his usual warm smile. Marcus was one of the few people who treated him like a human being. "You know," Marcus joked, "you probably know this building better than the CEO." Samuel chuckled. "I've had a little more time to explore." Marcus laughed, never realizing how true those words really were. At 8:30, employees flooded into the lobby. Expensive suits, designer handbags, coffee cups, Bluetooth headsets. Everyone rushing toward meetings. Almost nobody looked at Samuel. If they noticed him at all, it was only to complain. "Excuse me!" A young marketing manager snapped her fingers. "There's dust on my office shelf." Samuel nodded politely. "I'll take care of it right away." She rolled her eyes. "That's literally your job." He simply smiled. "It certainly is." Later that morning, another employee accidentally dropped an entire cup of coffee across the hallway. Without apologizing, he looked directly at Samuel. "Clean this up." As if speaking to a machine, Samuel quietly fetched his mop. No complaint. No anger. Just calm professionalism. Nearby, an intern whispered, "I don't know how he stays so patient." An older accountant answered quietly, "Some people are stronger than they look." Not everyone was cruel. Emily Carter, a 26-year-old software engineer, greeted Samuel every single morning. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks." He smiled. "Morning, Emily." One rainy afternoon, she noticed him eating lunch alone in the basement break room. She walked in carrying her sandwich. "Mind if I join you?" Samuel looked surprised. "Of course not." For the next 30 minutes, they talked about books, gardening, and classic movies. Emily laughed. "You know, you're one of the most interesting people in this building." Samuel smiled. "That's because you asked." Upstairs, however, the atmosphere was very different. The company's chief operating officer, Richard Kane, believed janitors should remain out of sight. Whenever he saw Samuel in the hallway, he frowned. "I don't want maintenance walking around executive offices during business hours." "But sir," Samuel replied politely, "I'm replacing broken lights." Richard waved dismissively. "Do it after everyone leaves." Samuel simply nodded. Richard Kane loved power. He measured people by titles, by salaries, by the cars they drove. A janitor, in his eyes, wasn't worth remembering. He didn't even know Samuel's last name. Every Friday, Crestview held an executive luncheon. The catering company always delivered extra meals. Samuel quietly packed the leftovers into containers and drove them to a nearby homeless shelter. Instead of throwing them away, he never told anyone. He never posted about it online. He simply believed food shouldn't be wasted. The shelter director often said, "Mr. Brooks, you help more people than you realize." Samuel always answered the same way. "We all do what we can." One afternoon, Emily found Samuel repairing an old wooden bench in the courtyard. "I thought maintenance handled furniture." "They do. So why are you fixing it?" He smiled. "Because someone might need a place to sit tomorrow." Emily watched him carefully sand the wood. "You always seem to think about other people?" Samuel shrugged. "Life gets easier when you stop asking what you deserve and start asking what you can give." She wrote those words in her notebook. She would never forget them. Meanwhile, inside the executive boardroom, Richard Kane addressed the senior leadership team. "Our founder hasn't visited headquarters in almost 5 years." Another executive laughed. "Does anyone even know if he's still alive?" Richard smirked. "The old man owns most of the company but never shows up. They say he's worth billions. I've never even seen him." Everyone laughed. None of them realized that the company's founder had, in fact, been inside the building every single day. Late that evening, after everyone left, Samuel walked into a quiet office on the top floor. Unlike the others, he had a key. He opened a hidden cabinet. Inside sat an old framed photograph. A much younger Samuel stood beside the first Crestview Technologies sign installed nearly 40 years earlier. Back then, the company had operated from a tiny rented garage. There had been only 3 employees. Samuel looked at the photo and smiled. So much has changed. He gently dusted the frame before locking the cabinet again. As he left the office, he overheard 2 executives talking in the hallway. "I swear," one of them laughed. "That janitor probably couldn't even afford the coffee we drank." Both men burst into laughter. Samuel kept walking. His expression never changed. But Marcus, the security guard, had heard every word. "They shouldn't talk to you like that," Marcus muttered. Samuel smiled gently. "People reveal their character by how they treat those they think can't change their lives." Marcus frowned. "What does that mean?" Samuel looked toward the glowing Crestview logo above the lobby. "You'll understand soon enough." Marcus watched him leave, puzzled. He had no idea that within days, the board of directors would announce an emergency company-wide meeting. Every employee, from interns to executives, would gather in the main auditorium. And when the mysterious owner finally stepped onto the stage, the entire room would fall into stunned silence. Monday morning began like every other. Samuel Brooks unlocked the front doors at exactly 5:15 a.m. He swept the marble floors, watered the plants, refilled the coffee station. By the time the first employees arrived, the building looked flawless. No one thanked him. He never expected them to. At 8:45 a.m., Richard Kane stormed through the lobby. "Who polished these floors?" Samuel looked up. "I did, sir." Richard frowned. "They're too slippery." "I'm sorry. I'll fix it immediately." Richard shook his head. "You people can't even get simple things right." Several employees heard the comment. Most kept walking. Emily didn't. She waited until Richard disappeared into the elevator. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." Samuel smiled. "Don't apologize for someone else's behavior." Later that morning, Emily noticed Samuel carrying several heavy boxes toward the storage room. "Let me help." "You don't have to." "I know." She picked up one of the boxes anyway. Inside were old company files dating back almost 40 years. Emily looked surprised. "These are older than I am." Samuel chuckled. "I remember when some of them were brand new." She laughed. "You've worked here forever, haven't you?" "A very long time." "Do you ever think about retiring?" Samuel paused before answering. "Not until I finish what I started." Emily assumed he meant cleaning. She had no idea he meant something much bigger. That afternoon, Richard Kane gathered department heads in the executive conference room. "We've received notice that the majority shareholder will attend Friday's annual board meeting." The room fell silent. "The owner?" Richard nodded. "The founder himself." One executive laughed nervously. "I've heard stories, but I've never met him." Richard adjusted his tie. "Neither have I." Another executive asked, "What if he starts making changes?" Richard smiled confidently. "He hasn't been involved in years." "I'm the one running this company." Several executives nodded in agreement. Outside the conference room, Samuel quietly replaced a burned-out light bulb. He heard every word. He simply smiled and continued working. During lunch, Samuel drove his old pickup truck to the homeless shelter with several trays of leftover food. The shelter director greeted him warmly. "You're early today." They had extra sandwiches. Children ran toward him. "Mr. Brooks." He laughed as they surrounded him. One little boy asked, "Did you bring cookies?" Samuel reached into a bag. "I might have found a few." The children cheered. To them, he wasn't a janitor. He was simply the kind man who never forgot them. As Samuel prepared to leave, the shelter director handed him a folder. The scholarship applications arrived. Samuel opened it and smiled. Every year, he secretly paid college tuition for 10 students who had grown up in the shelter. No interviews, no publicity, no announcements. The donations were always anonymous. The director once asked why. Samuel's answer never changed. Real generosity doesn't need applause. Back at Crestview Technologies, Emily accidentally left her laptop in the cafeteria. By the time she remembered everyone had gone home, she rushed back downstairs. The laptop sat neatly on the table with a handwritten note. "Thought you might come looking for this. Sam?" She smiled. Most people would have taken it to lost and found. Samuel had stayed nearly an hour later just to make sure she got it back. The next morning, rumors spread throughout the building. "The owner is arriving Friday. They say he's worth billions. I heard he travels with security. I heard he lives overseas. I heard he's over 90. Every employee had a different story. None of them were true. Richard Kane ordered every department to prepare presentations. "I want everything perfect. The founder needs to see how successful we've become." One manager asked, "Should we recognize the maintenance staff during the presentation?" Richard laughed. "The founder isn't coming here to meet janitors." The room filled with awkward laughter. Only one executive remained silent. Linda Harper, the company's longtime chief financial officer. She had joined Crestview 35 years earlier. Long before Richard. Long before most of the executives. She quietly looked toward the hallway where Samuel was polishing the windows. Something about Richard's comment clearly bothered her. That afternoon, Linda walked downstairs. "Good afternoon, Sam." He smiled warmly. "Hello, Linda." Unlike everyone else, she had always called him by his first name. "I hear Friday will be interesting." Samuel chuckled. "So I've heard." She looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Are you finally ready?" Samuel nodded slowly. "I think it's time." Linda smiled. "I've been waiting years to hear you say that." Emily happened to walk by just in time to hear the last sentence. She looked confused. "What are you two talking about?" Samuel winked. "Old memories." Thursday evening arrived. Employees worked late preparing reports. Richard rehearsed his speech 3 different times. Fresh flowers decorated the lobby. New banners were hung throughout the building. Everyone wanted to impress the mysterious owner. Ironically, the person they wanted to impress was quietly vacuuming the executive hallway. As Samuel finished cleaning, he entered the private boardroom after everyone had left. He opened a small drawer in the massive conference table. Inside rested an old brass key. He picked it up carefully. 40 years earlier, that key had opened the very first Crestview office. He carried it everywhere as a reminder of where the company had begun. Not with wealth, not with luxury, but with hard work. Before leaving, Samuel looked around the empty room. He remembered sleeping on the office floor during the company's early years. He remembered taking out a second mortgage to make payroll. He remembered personally assembling desks because the company couldn't afford furniture. Every success had come through sacrifice, not entitlement. The next morning, Friday, employees arrived wearing their best suits. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement. News cameras waited outside. Board members flew in from across the country. At precisely 9:55 a.m., Richard Kane stood confidently near the auditorium stage. He adjusted his expensive watch, straightened his tie, and smiled. In 5 minutes, he expected to impress the richest man in the company. Instead, he was about to discover that he had spent years insulting him. As the auditorium doors slowly opened, Samuel Brooks quietly walked inside, still wearing his janitor's uniform, still carrying his old mop bucket, and every eye in the room turned toward him. The auditorium fell completely silent. More than 600 employees sat in neat rows, waiting for the mysterious owner of Crestview Technologies to arrive. Executives adjusted their ties. Department managers checked their presentations. Richard Kane stood confidently beside the stage with a welcoming smile. Then, the back doors opened. Samuel Brooks quietly walked inside. He was still wearing his faded blue janitor's uniform. His mop bucket rolled behind him. Several employees laughed. "Did someone tell the janitor this meeting isn't for maintenance?" Another whispered, "He's probably here to clean up afterward." Richard frowned. "Mr. Brooks." Samuel stopped. "Yes, sir? This meeting is for executives and board members." "I know. So why are you here?" Samuel smiled politely. "I was invited." The room erupted with quiet laughter. Richard forced a smile. I'm sure there has been some misunderstanding. Before Samuel could answer, Linda Harper, the chief financial officer, stood up. There has been no misunderstanding. Every head turned toward her. She walked calmly across the stage. Then, to everyone's surprise, she extended her hand toward Samuel. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. The laughter disappeared instantly. Richard blinked. I'm sorry, what? Linda repeated herself. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Samuel shook her hand. Good morning, Linda. The board members immediately stood. One by one, they greeted Samuel with respect. Good morning, Mr. Brooks. It's wonderful to see you again. We're glad you could join us. Employees stared in disbelief. Emily covered her mouth. Marcus, the security guard standing near the door, smiled quietly. So that's what he meant. Richard looked completely confused. There must be some mistake. One of the senior board members turned toward him. There is no mistake. He addressed the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the founder, majority owner, and chairman of Crestview Technologies, Mr. Samuel Brooks. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room was frozen. Samuel slowly removed his old baseball cap. His silver hair was neatly combed. He smiled warmly at the employees. I suppose this is the part where everyone looks surprised. A few nervous laughs echoed through the auditorium. Even Richard couldn't speak. Samuel walked onto the stage without rushing. He placed his worn mop beside the podium. Then he looked across the audience. I started this company 40 years ago. Back then, Crestview operated from a tiny garage with 2 folding chairs and 1 borrowed computer. We couldn't afford office cleaners. So I cleaned the floors myself. We couldn't afford receptionists. So I answered the phones. We couldn't afford delivery drivers. So I made deliveries. He smiled. I never stopped believing that no job is beneath the person who owns the company. The audience listened in complete silence. I continued working as a janitor for one reason. He paused. I wanted to understand what kind of company we had become. Richard slowly lowered his head. Samuel continued, I wanted to see how people treated someone they believed had no power. His words felt heavier with every sentence. Titles don't reveal character. Power does. Samuel looked directly toward the executive section. I've watched people thank receptionists. I've watched people encourage interns. I've also watched people insult cleaners. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound angry. That somehow made his words even more powerful. Emily felt tears forming. She remembered every lunch they had shared. Every conversation. Every kind word. She had never once imagined she was talking to the billionaire founder of the company. Yet somehow, it made perfect sense. Samuel smiled gently. I've also witnessed incredible kindness. He looked toward Emily. Emily Carter. She looked startled. Would you please stand? Nervously, she stood. You've treated every employee in this building with respect. You helped carry boxes that weren't yours. You thanked people no one else noticed. You reminded me what this company was built to become. The room applauded. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Samuel turned toward Marcus. Marcus! The security guard stood. You've greeted every employee with the same smile. You've never judged anyone by their position. Thank you. Another round of applause followed. Marcus wiped away a tear. Then, Samuel's smile faded. He looked toward Richard Kane. The room became silent again. Mr. Kane, Richard slowly stood. You've delivered excellent financial results. Richard nodded hopefully. Our profits increased. Yes. Our stock reached record highs. Yes. Our expansion exceeded expectations. Samuel nodded. Also true. Richard allowed himself a small smile. Then Samuel continued. But you forgot the one number that matters most. Richard frowned. Which number? The number of people who stopped feeling valued after walking through these doors. The room became painfully quiet. Samuel reached into his pocket. He unfolded a small notebook. For the last 5 years, I wrote something down every day. He opened the notebook. Monday, February 14th. Co called maintenance staff invisible. He turned another page. April 6th. Executive threw coffee on the floor and ordered janitor. to clean it without apology. Another page. September 18th. Manager laughed at cafeteria worker during lunch. Samuel closed the notebook. I didn't record profits. I recorded character. Richard looked pale. Samuel raised his hand. No. For years, I listened. Today, you'll listen. The entire auditorium remained silent. Nobody dared interrupt. Samuel walked away from the podium. He picked up his old mop. Holding it in one hand, he smiled sadly. This mop has taught me more about leadership than any business school ever could. When you clean up after people every day, you discover who says thank you and who believes they're too important. He turned back toward the audience. Crestview Technologies will always measure success in dollars. But starting today, we'll also measure success in dignity. The employees applauded loudly. Some even stood. Richard remained frozen in place. He finally realized the quiet janitor he had mocked for years had been evaluating him every single day. And Samuel Brooks wasn't finished, because the next decision he announced would change the future of everyone in the company. The applause lasted nearly a full minute. When it finally faded, Samuel Brooks remained standing beside the podium, holding the same old mop he had pushed through the halls for years. He looked across the auditorium. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. I came to remind everyone why this company exists. He leaned the mop against the podium. Crestview Technologies wasn't built on expensive offices. It wasn't built on executive titles. It was built by people who showed up every day and did honest work. Samuel picked up a small leather folder from the podium. This folder contains the results of a 5-year internal culture review. Confused murmurs spread through the audience. Richard Kane frowned. A culture review? Samuel nodded. Every department, every executive, every manager. I wanted to know how people behaved when they believed no one important was watching. He smiled slightly. They never realized. I was watching. The large screen behind him lit up. A chart appeared. Employee respect survey. Overall employee satisfaction. 5 years ago, 94%. Current year, 61%. Gasps filled the room. Another chart appeared. Employee turnover. It had nearly doubled. Then another. Anonymous workplace complaints. Bullying. Disrespect. Favoritism. Harassment. Every graph pointed in the same direction. The company was making more money than ever. But its culture was falling apart. Samuel looked toward the executives. Profit without character is failure wearing an expensive suit. No one applauded. No one disagreed. Linda Harper stepped onto the stage. As Chief Financial Officer, I can confirm every number you've seen is accurate. She looked around the room. We've broken revenue records, but we've also broken trust. Her words landed heavily. Samuel turned toward Richard. Mr. Kane. Richard slowly stood. I'd like you to answer one question. Richard cleared his throat. Of course. When you saw me cleaning the lobby, what did you see? Richard hesitated. A janitor. Samuel nodded. Exactly. You never saw a person. You saw a position. Richard looked down. I was wrong. Samuel didn't interrupt. Richard continued quietly. I judged people by titles. I believed success made me better than others. I was ashamed of maintenance staff being visible. He swallowed hard. I forgot who actually keeps this company running. Samuel nodded. It takes courage to admit that. Then he added, but leadership also requires consequences. The room became silent again. Richard's face paled. Samuel addressed everyone, effective immediately. The position of Chief Operating Officer is vacant. A collective gasp echoed through the auditorium. Richard closed his eyes. He had expected criticism. He hadn't expected dismissal. Samuel raised his hand. This isn't punishment. It's accountability. You cannot build a culture of respect under leadership that practices disrespect. Security didn't escort Richard out. Samuel refused to humiliate him. Instead, Richard quietly removed his company badge and placed it on the podium. I understand. Samuel extended his hand. Richard looked surprised. You built profitable systems. I hope someday you also build character. Richard shook his hand with tears in his eyes. For the first time in years, I think I'm finally going to start. Without another word, Richard walked out of the auditorium. No one laughed. No one celebrated. The silence itself was the lesson. Samuel smiled gently. Now, let's talk about the future. The next slide appeared. The Crestview Promise. Every employee matters. Every voice deserves respect. Every job has dignity. The audience erupted into applause. Samuel continued, "Starting today, the executive dining room is permanently closed." Several executives looked confused. There will no longer be separate cafeterias. We eat together. We work together. We succeed together. Another round of applause followed. And one more change. He smiled. Beginning next month, every executive, including the CEO, board members, and department heads, will spend one full day, each quarter working alongside maintenance, security, cafeteria staff, and customer support. Laughter spread through the room. Samuel laughed too. I'm not joking. The applause became even louder. Even employees who had rarely smiled at work found themselves standing. Emily couldn't stop smiling. She whispered to Marcus, "This company is never going to be the same." Marcus grinned. "No, I think it's finally becoming what it was supposed to be." Before ending the meeting, Samuel walked back toward his old mop. He picked it up. He held it in the air, "will stay in my office." Not as a reminder of cleaning floors, but as a reminder that leadership begins with service. The audience stood for a second standing ovation. Many employees were wiping away tears. As everyone prepared to leave, Samuel called out, "Emily Carter." She turned. "Would you stay for a few minutes?" She nodded nervously. Within minutes, the massive auditorium emptied. Only Samuel, Linda, Marcus, and Emily remained. Samuel smiled. "You once asked me why I never retired." Emily nodded. "I remember. I told you I wasn't finished." He looked around the empty auditorium. "Now, I finally am." Emily smiled. "What happens next?" Samuel looked out the auditorium windows toward the Chicago skyline. "Next, I'm looking for someone who believes leadership is earned, not inherited." He turned back toward Emily. "And I think I've already found that person." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean?" Samuel smiled. "I'd like to talk to you about the future of Crestview Technologies." Emily's heart began to race. She had joined the company as a junior software engineer just 3 years earlier. Now, the founder himself was about to offer her an opportunity that would change her life forever. Emily sat quietly across from Samuel in the executive boardroom. It was the first time she had ever entered the room. Only hours earlier, she had walked into work as a junior software engineer. Now she was sitting across from the company's founder. She looked around nervously. "I don't think I belong here." Samuel smiled. "That's exactly why you do." She looked confused. "What do you mean?" "The people who chase power usually shouldn't have it. The people who fear the responsibility often respect it the most." Linda Harper placed 2 cups of coffee on the table. "Mr. Brooks has been watching more than the executives." Emily looked surprised. Samuel nodded. "For 3 years. I've watched how people solve problems, how they treat coworkers, how they react under pressure." Emily laughed nervously. "I thought nobody even noticed me." Samuel smiled. "Real leaders notice everyone." He opened a folder. Inside were dozens of handwritten notes. Each page carried Emily's name. Emily's eyes widened. "You kept notes about me?" Samuel nodded. "Not about your programming skills, about your character." He read one entry. "Stayed 3 hours after work to help an intern finish a project. Never asked for recognition." Another returned a bonus she received by mistake. Another shared credit with her team after a successful software launch. Samuel closed the folder. "Skills can be taught. Integrity cannot." Emily looked down. "My father always said, 'Your reputation is built by what you do when nobody's watching.'" Samuel smiled. He was a wise man. Across town, Richard Kane sat alone in a small coffee shop. For 20 years, he had entered luxury offices through private executive entrances. Today, he was updating his resume. His phone remained silent. No calls. No emails. No job offers. He looked around at ordinary people chatting over coffee. For the first time in years, nobody recognized him. It was strangely humbling. A young waitress approached. Would you like a refill? Richard smiled politely. Yes, please. As she walked away, he caught himself. Months earlier, he probably wouldn't have looked up from his phone. Now he found himself saying, Thank you. The waitress smiled warmly. You're welcome. Such a small exchange, yet it reminded him how little kindness actually cost. Back at Crestview Technologies, Samuel called for another company-wide meeting. Employees filled the auditorium once again. This time the atmosphere was different. People greeted janitors. Executives held doors open. The cafeteria workers received smiles instead of complaints. It had only been 1 week, yet the building already felt different. Samuel stepped onto the stage. I have another announcement. He smiled. I've spent 40 years building this company. My greatest responsibility isn't deciding who runs it today. It's deciding who protects it tomorrow. He turned toward Emily. Miss Carter. She slowly walked onto the stage, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Samuel addressed the audience. Many of you believe leadership begins in the boardroom. He shook his head. It begins in hallways, in break rooms, in parking lots. It's revealed in how we treat people who can do nothing for us. He smiled toward Emily. I've found someone who understands that. Emily looked completely overwhelmed. Samuel continued, effective immediately, I am creating the position of executive, director of company, culture and employee development. The audience applauded. Samuel smiled. And I'd like Emily Carter to become the first person to hold that position. Emily froze. What? I don't have executive experience. Samuel laughed. Neither did I when I started. I was repairing computers in a garage. The audience laughed softly. Emily shook her head. There are people far more qualified. Samuel nodded. There are, but qualifications build businesses. Character builds legacies. The room erupted into applause. Emily accepted the position with tears in her eyes. I promise one thing. Samuel smiled. What is it? I'll never forget where I came from. Samuel nodded proudly. That's why I chose you. The following Monday, Emily made her first decision. She removed every reserved executive parking space. Employees were shocked. One vice president asked, Where do executives park now? Emily smiled. Where everyone else parks? Another executive complained. But I'll have to walk farther. Emily smiled politely. So will everyone. Within days, reserved elevators disappeared. Private executive lounges became employee collaboration spaces. Managers began eating lunch beside interns. The invisible walls inside the company slowly disappeared. One afternoon, Marcus found Samuel polishing a brass plaque in the lobby. It had been covered for years. What does it say? Marcus asked. Samuel wiped away the dust. The inscription read, No job is beneath the person who truly leads. Marcus smiled. I like that. Samuel chuckled. I wrote it 40 years ago. I guess it was time people finally read it. That evening, as employees prepared to leave, dozens of them stopped beside the maintenance closet, one after another. They thanked the cleaning staff, not because Samuel was watching, because they had finally learned to see them. One janitor quietly wiped away tears. I've worked here 12 years. No one's ever thanked me before. Emily overheard the comment. She smiled, then quietly wrote something in her notebook. Culture changes one conversation at a time. She knew the journey wasn't over, because one final challenge remained. A challenge that would test whether Crestview had truly changed. Or whether people had simply changed because they were being watched. And Samuel Brooks was about to find out. 6 months passed. Crestview Technologies no longer felt like the same company. The changes were visible everywhere. Executives greeted receptionists by name. Managers helped interns during busy projects. The cafeteria buzzed with conversations between employees from every department. For the first time in years, the building felt less like a corporation and more like a community. Samuel Brooks watched it all quietly. But he still had one final test. He wanted to know whether people had changed because they believed in respect, or because they feared disappointing the founder. One Monday morning, Samuel arrived before sunrise. Instead of wearing his familiar blue janitor's uniform, he dressed in worn jeans, an old flannel shirt, and a faded jacket. He looked like an elderly maintenance worker from another building. Even Marcus barely recognized him. "Mr. Brooks?" Samuel smiled. "Today I'm just Sam." Marcus grinned. "So, another lesson?" Samuel winked. "The last one." That afternoon, a delivery truck arrived carrying expensive computer equipment. The driver accidentally dropped a large crate near the loading dock. Papers scattered everywhere. The elderly man, Samuel in disguise, immediately knelt to help gather the papers. Employees walked past. Some were busy, some barely noticed. Then Emily appeared. Without hesitation, she knelt beside him. "Let's get these before the wind takes them." Within seconds, 3 interns joined. Then 2 engineers. Then a marketing manager. Soon, nearly a dozen employees were helping. No one knew the old man was the company's founder. They were simply helping because someone needed help. Samuel smiled to himself. This time, no one had to be told. Later that day, another small test unfolded. A new intern accidentally spilled coffee across the lobby. She looked terrified. "I'm so sorry." Before any janitor could arrive, the vice president of engineering walked over. "It's okay." He grabbed paper towels and began cleaning the floor himself. The intern stared in disbelief. "You don't have to do that." He smiled. "We all work here." Samuel watched from a distance. Months earlier, the same executive would have walked away without a second thought. Now he simply cleaned the mess and returned to work. That evening, Samuel invited Emily to the rooftop terrace. The city lights stretched across the Chicago skyline. "It worked," Samuel said. Emily looked confused. "What worked?" "The culture." She smiled. "You really think so?" "I know so." He handed her a small notebook. It was the same notebook he had carried for 5 years, the one filled with observations. The final page held only one sentence. "Today, people helped because kindness became a habit." Emily read it twice, then looked at Samuel. "I couldn't have done this without you." Samuel shook his head. "No, you couldn't have done it without everyone choosing to change." Meanwhile, Richard Kane had spent months rebuilding his own life. He found work as the operations manager for a small family-owned manufacturing company. The office was modest. The salary was far lower than before. But every morning, he personally greeted each employee at the door. One day, a janitor accidentally bumped into him while carrying supplies. Paint splashed across Richard's shoes. The young man immediately apologized. "I'm so sorry, sir." Richard smiled. "Are you okay?" The janitor looked surprised. "You aren't angry?" Richard quietly laughed. "I used to care too much about shoes. I've learned there are more important things." Word spread quickly through the small company. Their new manager treated everyone with respect. Slowly, the workplace began changing there too. Back at Crestview, Samuel made one last announcement. Every employee gathered in the auditorium once again. He stepped onto the stage wearing a simple gray suit. No mop, no janitor's uniform, just the founder everyone now knew. "I have spent 40 years building this company." He paused. "And I have learned one important truth." He looked across the audience. "Buildings don't create great companies. People do." He smiled. "Today, I officially announce my retirement." The room fell silent. Many employees looked shocked. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Samuel continued, "I am not leaving because I'm tired. I'm leaving because I finally believe. Crestview no longer depends on one person." He turned toward Emily. "It depends on all of you." The audience rose to its feet. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. Marcus wiped away tears. Linda smiled proudly. Even longtime employees who had known Samuel for decades struggled to hold back their emotions. As the applause faded, Samuel reached into his pocket. He removed the old brass key to the company's first office. 40 years of memories rested in his hand. He walked toward Emily. "This opened our first office." He placed it gently into her palm. "It no longer opens a door. It opens a responsibility." Emily held the key carefully. "I'll protect what you've built." Samuel smiled. "I know you will." As everyone left the auditorium, Samuel walked alone through the quiet lobby one last time. He paused beside the maintenance closet. Inside, hanging neatly on a hook, was his old blue janitor's uniform. He ran his hand across the worn fabric, then smiled. It served its purpose. He quietly closed the door. But one final chapter remained, because before Samuel left Crestview forever, he had one surprise that would change hundreds of lives and become the greatest legacy he ever left behind. 3 months after Samuel Brooks announced his retirement, the headquarters of Crestview Technologies looked different than ever before. The marble floors still gleamed every morning. The flowers in the lobby were always fresh. The employees still greeted one another by name, but something had changed that no one could see. People no longer worked because they feared their bosses. They worked because they felt they belonged. Samuel had retired, yet his presence remained everywhere. On a bright Monday morning, Emily Carter unlocked the executive office that had once belonged to Samuel. She hadn't changed much. The expensive furniture was still there. The walls remained simple. The only addition was a small framed sign on her desk. Leadership begins with service. It was the first thing visitors noticed. And exactly what Samuel would have wanted. Marcus, the security supervisor, knocked gently. "Morning, Ms. Carter." Emily smiled. "Morning, Marcus." He handed her an envelope. It arrived this morning. There was no return address. Only one sentence written neatly across the front. "Open during today's leadership meeting." Emily immediately recognized the handwriting. Samuel's. She smiled. He planned this before he retired. At 10 o'clock, every department manager gathered inside the boardroom. Many were new. Several older executives had retired or moved on. The company had become younger, more diverse, more united. Emily stood at the front of the room. "Before we begin, I'd like to share something Mr. Brooks left for us." She opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The room became silent. Emily began reading aloud. "If you're hearing this letter, then Crestview has continued without me." "Good." A few people smiled. "Never build a company that depends on one person. Build one that inspires thousands." She continued, "Remember that every employee who walks through these doors is carrying a story you know nothing about. Someone is caring for a sick parent. Someone is struggling to pay rent. Someone is celebrating becoming a father. Someone else may be fighting loneliness. Treat every person with kindness. You never know which battle they're fighting." Several managers quietly lowered their eyes. Emily turned the page. "One day you'll be remembered. Not for quarterly profits. Not for your job title. But for how people felt after spending time with you. Choose wisely." She folded the letter. No one spoke. For nearly a minute. Finally, one manager quietly said, "I've attended leadership seminars worth thousands of dollars. That letter taught me more than all of them." Everyone nodded. Meanwhile, Samuel's retirement looked nothing like people expected. He didn't buy a mansion. He didn't travel the world. Instead, he purchased an abandoned community center on Chicago's South Side. The building had been empty for years. Broken windows, leaking roof, peeling paint. Most people saw an old building ready to be demolished. Samuel saw possibility. 6 months later, the building reopened. Its new sign read, "The Brooks Community Learning Center." Inside were classrooms, computer labs, a public library, free tutoring, career counseling, financial literacy workshops. Everything was completely free. No cameras, no advertisements, no publicity, just opportunity. One afternoon, Emily came to visit. She found Samuel assembling bookshelves with a cordless drill. She laughed. "You're supposed to be retired." Samuel smiled. "I changed buildings. I didn't stop working." Children filled the reading room. Teenagers practiced coding. Veterans attended resume workshops. Retired teachers volunteered as tutors. The building buzzed with life. Emily looked around in amazement. "You built another company." Samuel laughed. "No, I built something more valuable." "What?" "A place where nobody has to feel invisible." That evening, local reporters arrived. "Mr. Brooks, would you mind giving us an interview?" Samuel politely declined. The reporter looked surprised. "People should know what you've done." Samuel smiled. If they notice the building, that's enough. Weeks later, something unexpected happened. One of Crestview's competitors experienced a major financial crisis. Hundreds of employees faced immediate layoffs. The news spread quickly. Board members at Crestview called an emergency meeting. What should we do? One executive asked. Emily thought for a moment, then smiled. I know exactly what Mr. Brooks would do. Within 48 hours, Crestview announced a hiring initiative. They offered interviews to every displaced employee. No publicity, no press conference. Just open doors. More than 300 families avoided unemployment. When Samuel heard the news, he smiled quietly. They've learned. That winter, Crestview celebrated its 40th anniversary. Employees expected a lavish corporate event. Instead, Emily organized something different. Every employee received a paid volunteer day. Some helped build homes. Others served meals at shelters. Some cleaned public parks. Executives worked beside interns. Programmers painted classrooms. Managers packed food boxes. For one day, the entire company served the community. It became the highest-rated employee event in company history. That evening, Emily visited Samuel. I borrowed your idea. Samuel laughed. Which one? Leading by serving. He smiled proudly. I was hoping someone would. As they walked through the community center, a little boy approached Samuel. Mr. Brooks? Yes? When I grow up, I want to own a company. Samuel knelt beside him. Wonderful. The boy smiled. I want everyone there to be happy. Samuel placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Then you've already learned the most important lesson. Emily watched the conversation. She realized something. Samuel had never really been teaching people how to build businesses. He had been teaching them how to build people. And that was a legacy far greater than billions of dollars. Only one final chapter remained. The chapter that would reveal why Samuel had spent years pushing a mop through the halls of his own company, and why employees would never forget the quiet janitor who changed their lives forever. 10 years later, Crestview Technologies had become one of the most respected companies in America. Not because it was the largest, not because it earned the highest profits, but because people genuinely wanted to work there. Business schools taught the Crestview culture model. Leadership conferences invited Emily Carter to explain how a struggling workplace had transformed into one of the happiest companies in the country. Every presentation ended with the same sentence displayed on the screen. Respect is not a policy, it's a daily choice. Whenever someone asked where the idea came from, Emily always smiled. From a janitor. Samuel Brooks was now 74 years old. His hair had turned completely white. His steps were slower. But every Tuesday morning, he still walked into the Brooks Community Learning Center, carrying a box of books under one arm. The children greeted him exactly as they always had. Mr. Brooks! He smiled. Who's ready for today's story? Hands shot into the air. Samuel laughed. I thought so. To the children, he wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't a famous businessman. He was simply the kind old man who believed every child deserved encouragement. One afternoon, Emily arrived unexpectedly. I have someone I'd like you to meet. Beside her stood a young man wearing a Crestview employee badge. This is Ethan. He started as our night janitor 2 years ago. Samuel shook the young man's hand. It's nice to meet you. Ethan smiled nervously. It's an honor, sir. Emily grinned. You know what he did last month? Samuel looked curious. He designed a software tool that reduced our warehouse costs by 30%. Samuel raised his eyebrows. Really? Ethan nodded. I worked on it after my shifts. Samuel smiled proudly. And? Emily laughed. We promoted him to Operations Innovation Manager. Samuel looked at Ethan. Never let anyone convince you that your first job decides your future. Ethan smiled. I won't. A few months later, Crestview celebrated its 50th anniversary. Employees expected another corporate gala. Instead, invitations directed everyone to the company's original garage. The tiny building had been restored exactly as it looked decades earlier. Old wooden desks, a worn toolbox, the first company computer. Even Samuel's original broom hung on the wall. A small brass plaque beneath it read, "Every great company begins with people willing to do ordinary work extraordinarily well." Hundreds of employees toured the little garage. Many couldn't believe a billion-dollar company had begun in such a small place. An intern whispered, "This is where it all started?" Emily nodded. "Yes, and Mr. Brooks never wanted us to forget it." As the ceremony began, Emily stepped onto the stage. She looked toward Samuel sitting quietly in the front row. "Today we're honoring the founder of Crestview Technologies." Samuel smiled politely. Emily continued, "But not because he built a successful business." She paused. "We're honoring him because he taught us that success means nothing if people lose their dignity." Along the way, the audience rose to its feet. The applause seemed endless. Samuel looked embarrassed. He never enjoyed attention. When the applause finally ended, Emily invited him to speak. Samuel slowly walked to the microphone. He looked across hundreds of smiling faces. Some had worked with him for decades. Others had never known him as the janitor. Yet all of them knew his story. He took a deep breath. "When I was a young man, I believed success meant building the biggest company possible." He smiled softly. "I was wrong." The room grew quiet. "The greatest thing we ever built." He looked around the audience. "That was trust." He continued. "There was a time when people laughed at an old janitor. I never became angry. Do you know why?" Nobody answered. "Because people can only insult your position. They cannot diminish your character." The audience nodded. Samuel looked toward the maintenance staff seated together. He smiled warmly. "Would every member of our cleaning team please stand?" They looked surprised. Slowly they stood. The room erupted into applause. Then every employee stood with them. Not for Samuel, for the people who quietly cared for the building every single day. Many janitors wiped away tears. One whispered, "In 30 years, I've never felt so appreciated." Samuel smiled. "That's the company I always dreamed of." Emily stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. "This was found in Mr. Brooks's office after his retirement." She handed it to him. Samuel opened it slowly. Inside lay 3 things: his first office key, his old employee ID, and the faded blue baseball cap he had worn while cleaning the building. He laughed quietly. "I wondered where this went." Emily smiled. "We had it framed." Behind them, a curtain dropped. The audience gasped. Mounted inside a beautiful glass display were the cap, the mop, the brass key, and a simple plaque. It read, "Samuel Brooks, founder, janitor, leader. No job is beneath the person who truly leads." The audience gave another standing ovation. A year later, Samuel Brooks passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was surrounded by family, close friends, and the people whose lives he had touched. News spread across the country. Thousands attended his memorial service. Not just business leaders, teachers, janitors, security guards, engineers, students, shelter volunteers, children from the community center, people from every walk of life. Each had a different story, but they all described the same man: kind, humble, respectful. During the memorial, Emily stood before the crowd. She held the same notebook Samuel had carried while working as a janitor. She opened to the final page. Instead of observations, there was one handwritten sentence: "If people remember me, I hope it's because they learned to see one another." Emily closed the notebook. Tears filled her eyes. He succeeded. Years later, every new Crestview employee attended orientation in the old garage. Before learning about software, before learning about company policies, they heard the story of the quiet janitor, not because he was secretly the owner, but because he proved that true greatness is revealed in how we treat people who can offer us nothing in return. The story ended with a simple question displayed on the screen. How will people feel after they meet you today? For many employees, it became the most important question they asked themselves every morning. And in the heart of Crestview Technologies, an old mop, a faded cap, and a brass key quietly reminded everyone that the strongest leaders are never those who stand above others, but those who are never afraid to stand beside them. The end. If this story inspired you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that every person has unique gifts. Your support helps us share more heartwarming stories that inspire hope, kindness, and perseverance.